I thought I would open this video by stating the obvious. Writing a book is hard. It's even hard for experienced authors, but writing a novel can be especially daunting if you've never written one before. So in this video, I wanted to share something I've kept hidden in a folder for almost a decade and a half. It was the true genesis of my writing career, even though I wouldn't know it back then. So let's get into it. Hello everyone, I'm Aaron Dusk, indie author of two books, The Varcross Key and The Mark of Amulii. And speaking of The Mark of Amulii, that's actually the topic of today's video. So back when I was, around 18 to 25, I wrote a lot of fan fiction. I immersed myself more into the fan fiction I loved rather than reading a lot of books. The reason for this was because with books, you never know you never know if you'll like the characters or the world or the story. But, for fan fiction, you're gonna most likely know what you're getting into. And you can tell right away whether you'll like the story by reading the tags and the titles. So all fan fiction sites allow the writers to add these tags to attract the right audience. For example, if you tag a story with like a lemon, I don't know if it's still that today. I know that there's a lot of sub-genres regarding this, but lemons back in the day used to basically mean porn. It was just smut. So you had lemons for smut, you had AU for alternate universe, which is usually a fan fiction writer's reach into original fiction using familiar characters. Think of 50 Shades of Grey, for example. That was Twilight fan fiction, but it was alternate universe, so she could actually file the character names off of there and use her own and publish it as a book. There's also like crossovers when you combine two or more fandoms. The list goes on and on. So you can find just about anything you want, but you'll always have some sort of familiar constant. I was very much into slash, of course, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with the terminology, slash fan fiction is when you slash together two characters of the same sex in a relationship. So for example, one of the very first slash fictions would probably be the Kirk slash Spock fan fictions. And fan fiction actually had its original roots in Star Trek. It was very popular at the time to write fan fiction of Star Trek. It wasn't until I was about 27 that I hit one of the lowest points in my life. I was unemployed, I was taking care of a sick father, I was dealing with a horrible mental illness at the time, which led to anxiety so bad that I couldn't get into my car, I couldn't even leave my house. It was like that for almost 7 months. I won't get into my history of mental illness or the abuse I suffered as a child, but it all played a role into what would eventually happen. So, one night I woke up from a weird dream which involved a werewolf named Amulii saving me from people shooting at me. He took me by the hand and he pulled me through a portal, and it was about 3 in the morning, and I was like, that was a really cool story. So I just started. It was a really cool dream. So I started writing the story, which, I would meet this creature. Alex was me, just a younger version, because the best moments of my life, despite what I was going through at home, were in high school, at least back then. Since I had only ever written fan fiction, I had no idea what I was doing. I had never created completely original characters before. I'd never been to the western parts of Canada, but I'd always wanted to go. So I started looking up remote places in British Columbia, but I ended up somehow stumbling upon a picture of Spirit Island in Jasper National Park, Alberta. It was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen in pictures. And if, a wolf man did exist from another world, he would probably end up here somewhere. I couldn't picture them really anywhere else but here. So because I wasn't working or doing much of anything else, I lost myself in the world and the characters. Every day I would wake up, sit down at my computer, and pick up where I left off, always wanting to know what else was going to happen next. I did this for about a month before I was finished, and that was when the spark happened. I realized I loved writing original stories. But when I went back to read what I had written, the story changed. Even though I had fallen in love with the world as I was writing it, going back to read what I'd written made me fall out of love with it almost immediately. It was awful. I couldn't believe I'd written something so bad, but I couldn't figure out why it was bad. I didn't know how to start a story or pace a story properly. I didn't know anything about cadence, point of view, showing versus telling, filtering language, nothing. All that I knew was I was not enjoying what I'd written. It became even worse when I tried to write the second book, which I ended up not finishing because I had no idea where I was going to be taking it. I was trying to write a full-blown high fantasy without understanding the very fundamentals of storytelling itself. Writing stories became way too hard, and I got discouraged, which eventually led to me giving up altogether. This also coincided with me getting a job at a company I ended up, spending the next decade working for. So I had other things I needed to learn, and writing just wasn't up there at the top of the list. It wouldn't be until the spring of 2020, during the pandemic, that something would happen that would lure me back into the world of writing. Only this time, I not only had the time, but also the desire to learn everything I could about the craft. I had two main goals here. I wanted to lose 180 pounds, and I wanted to publish my first book. And I wanted to do all of that in 2 years. Both of these goals together kept me focused, and the rest was pretty much history. So now that you guys know how it started, let's go all the way back to the first draft of the Mark of Amulii. You're probably wondering why I've kept this all these years, and there are a couple of reasons. Number one, it was my very first novel. When you write your very first novel, you want to keep that. It's sort of like, it's sort of like a time capsule. And then number two, whenever I feel like I'm stagnating or that my writing is absolutely terrible, I'll look back on this draft and see how far I've come in a relatively short period of time. So I want to share some scenes throughout the book and explain what's wrong with them and how I would fix them, if they can be fixed. So let's start from the very beginning. So I wasn't really sure how I wanted to do this, so the only logical conclusion I came to was to just make a PowerPoint presentation, as you do. And so I'm going to read the first paragraph of this first draft of the Mark of Amulii, and I want you guys, when you're reading along with me, to see if you're asking any questions or to see if anything piques your interest at all as I'm going through it. So with that out of the way, let's start. Alexander Hunt was 17 when he moved to Jasper National Park in Alberta. His father was an ex-United States Marine who worked closely with the park as a ranger and hiking guide. His mother was a doctor in the field of biology. She was a renowned geneticist and had published a few books on biochemistry. They weren't thrilled with the idea of moving from suburbia to live in the middle of nowhere. Alex had to leave his school and friends, and his mother had to quit her job after 20 years of employment. Okay, so from the very first sentence, absolutely nothing held my interest. And if you guys read my blog post about beginnings, you'll know that this entire paragraph goes against everything that makes a beginning engaging. Also, in case you didn't notice, this is two paragraphs kind of smushed together, considering we went from introducing the characters to then explaining how they felt at the end there. So it didn't seem like, if you notice that they didn't kind of seem like they went together, well, that usually means you have to start a new paragraph because it's a different subject matter altogether. So I start by introducing the character, and as a newbie writer, you would think, hey, that's what you're supposed to do. But remember, these opening paragraphs need to push and pull on a reader's curiosity. If everything is just told to the reader through just one big exposition dump, then the reader isn't engaging with the story. The first sentence should have the reader asking questions, and the subsequent paragraphs should be answering those questions while creating more questions. This is what pushes the reader through these rough moments in the story. And I say rough moments because, remember, no one's invested yet. No one's invested in any of these characters. They don't care about your characters. They don't care what's really happening on the page yet. You have to make them care by naturally pulling them along, engaging their senses, engaging their curiosity, keeping them guessing while painting pictures of the characters and the settings in their minds. So what does this paragraph do? Well, I mean, it basically just lists facts about each character that could have been easily woven naturally throughout the first chapter by introducing each of the characters. The real story doesn't even start until 5 paragraphs in, when we finally get, the setting of where Alex is at. Before that, we're just given a giant info dump about the characters, we don't even care about yet. No one is going to remember any of these details. In fact, I don't think anyone's really going to read past this first paragraph. So what would I do to fix it? Well, I'm not going to actually rewrite anything here, but I will say, I would basically delete the first 5 paragraphs of, just introducing the characters. And then I would start, with Alex making his way across the land bridge of Spirit Island, but he's got this feeling like someone's watching him. That would make a much more engaging and interesting opening than just listing a bunch of random facts about these people we have no interest in whatsoever. Scene 2. The next morning, Alex was startled awake by a loud banging coming from his front door. He looked over at his alarm clock and saw it was 10 in the morning. He hadn't slept in like this for a while, and he was surprised his mother didn't wake him up before she left. The banging continued, followed by a few scratching sounds. They were loud and irregular, and Alex didn't know what to make of it. He jumped out of bed and dashed over to his dresser to put on his shirt. It's really hard. I'm sorry, it's really hard not to laugh when I'm reading this, but you've probably noticed as I read aloud that there's something odd with how the sentences sound. This is not how a narrator would naturally speak while reading the story. The sentences are all roughly the same length, and the paragraph has a jumble of different things going on in it. Alex is startled awake by loud banging. Then we kind of take a break from that to then, tell the reader he hadn't slept like this in a while, and he wondered why his mother hadn't woken him up yet. And that just completely destroys the tension I had originally wanted to convey in these first sentences. So with each sentence, it reads more like a list of things that are just happening instead of the character processing any of it. And remember what I said about the sentences being the same length? This is called cadence. Cadence and rhythm go hand in hand. Everyone speaks with a certain cadence, and narration is no different. Because when we're reading, the voice in our heads is speaking to us. If there's no proper rhythm or cadence in the sentences, the voice in our head is going to start sounding more and more monotone and robotic, like it's reading from a technical manual instead of just reading from a work of fiction. So how would I fix this paragraph? Well, let's start with the first sentence. The next morning, Alex was startled awake by a loud banging coming from the front door. So I would change that to just something very simple. Banging from downstairs startled Alex awake. So, as you can see, that sentence had a lot more impact, but it was a lot shorter. Since we're starting the next chapter, we don't really need the next morning, especially since Alex looks at his alarm clock in the following sentence. I also got rid of the passive voice. So instead of the subject Alex being startled by the object banging, the banging becomes the subject that's doing the startling, and Alex becomes the object receiving the action. So this gets rid of that pesky passive voice and kind of adds more impact to the sentence. You probably remember passive voice from high school English, and since I brought up high school English, many of you are probably having nightmares of diagramming sentences. But when you become a writer, you start to understand the reason your English teacher had you do those things. When you can break any sentence down into its basic parts, it makes revising and editing so much easier because you start to understand what's important in a sentence and what can be left out as filler. So with that said, notice how the impact of the sentence completely changed. New writers often think that more words, that the more words you pack into a sentence, the more impact it will have on the reader. But a lot of times the opposite is true. You want to convey as much information as possible while writing the least amount of words. This sentence does exactly that. Or if you're going to write a lot of words, you want to make each one of those words, add to the sentence. You don't want them repeating. You don't want them just saying, useless things. You want each word to have an impact, to make sense, to drive that sentence forward without boring the reader. For the next part, he looked over at his alarm clock and saw it was 10 in the morning. He hadn't slept like this for a while, and he was surprised his mother didn't wake him up before she left. The banging continued, followed by a few scratching sounds. They were loud and irregular, and Alex didn't know what to make of it. He jumped out of bed and dashed over to his dresser to put on a shirt. Just reading that again. Oh. So the first sentence is bogged down with filtering language, and I'll explain what that is in just a second. So even though the story is written in third person omniscient, which I'll get into why that's a bad thing later, we want the reader to experience what's happening to the character. When we use filtering language, like he looked or he saw in this particular sentence, we're putting even more distance between the reader and the character. Right now, we're in Alex's point of view, so we know he's looking at things. So we can just say the alarm clock display read 10 o'clock. In fact, we can do even better than this and not have Alex read the clock at all. We can just describe the setting in such a way that we know the approximate time. This allows the reader to feel like they're more a part of the scene rather than reading it. As I rewrite these sentences, I want you to notice how the rhythm and cadence is varied, allowing for a much more natural way of reading. So let's go to the next, or let's go to how I would have changed it. Banging from downstairs startled Alex awake. He rubbed his eyes and groaned as a narrow beam of sunlight peeked through a slit in the curtains. Still half asleep and not wanting to leave the comfort of the duvet, he pulled it over his head and tried to close his eyes again, hoping the visitor would leave. When the banging grew louder and more irregular, Alex threw off the covers and reluctantly rolled out of bed. He grabbed a folded shirt from his dresser drawer and slipped into it before stumbling toward the hallway. Another thing to remember is you don't have to start every sentence with "he did this" and "he did that." Sentence cadence means varying how you start each sentence as well as the length of the sentence, so not everything sounds the same all the time. So, the next scene. "What the hell, man?" Alex asked, still a little groggy from being startled awake. "Were you trying to break down my door or something?" The stranger looked at him intensely, half smiling as he reached for Alex's face with his dirty hand. There was something really familiar about his eyes. It was eerie. Alex pulled away instinctively. He started to get a very odd vibe from this stranger, but he couldn't place his finger on just what that was. The taller boy backed away for a moment, as if he realized this wasn't normal behavior. "I apologize," he said, looking down at the floor. "I guess I was kind of excited to see you again." His voice had a deep, raspy tone. Alex looked at the stranger and tried to remember if he had seen him somewhere before. "I don't remember seeing you," he said, eyeing his visitor as he walked further inside the house without being invited. Have we met?" "We did, once," he said with one eyebrow raised. "I have been watching you for a while." God damn. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this sentence that it reads very strangely and it's very repetitive. So I'm sure a lot of you can see some of the glaring issues. So for one, as I mentioned before, it's needlessly repetitive, and I'm telling a lot of what I should be showing. And you've probably heard this show don't tell thing a lot, but and I will say there are times when you should tell, but there are also a lot of times when you should be showing. And right now, I need to be showing the reader a lot more than I am in these sentences. We're told over and over how strange Amulii is, how eerie the situation is. Then we have these lines of narration telling the reader Alex kind of remembers seeing the guy, but in the line of dialogue directly below it, we repeat almost exactly the same thing. So I see this happen with a lot of newer writers. I've read a lot of new writers in critique, when I'm critiquing them, and they feel like they have to explain everything and then repeat it instead of just dripping this information through body language, facial expressions, feelings, and actions. Also remember, if the dialogue can explain something, by all means, just use the dialogue. So how would we fix this? Let's start with the first few sentences. What the hell, man? Are you trying to break down my door or something? So notice, the reader already knows that Alex just woke up. That was already inferred in the very first sentence of the chapter. So you need to realize that the reader will pick up on nuances, foreshadowing, or even mood. It doesn't have to be painstakingly described and repeated. All this does is just add unnecessary words the reader, now has to wade through, and they already know it. So this is how I rewrote it. What the hell, man? Are you trying to break down my door or something? Notice how different that is from what the hell, man? Alex asked, still a little groggy from being startled awake. No, that's very, very repetitive. Were you trying to break my door down or something? So this just shortens everything. It makes it more punchy. It makes it more impactful. We don't really need to say that Alex said this. We already know that Alex is saying this because of the context of the sentence itself. So something else a lot of new writers do is they tend to put dialogue tags after almost every sentence. You don't have to do that. Sometimes the dialogue itself is already self-explanatory, as is with this case. Let's go to the next sentence. The stranger looked at him intensely, half smiling as he reached for Alex's face with his dirty hands. There was something really familiar about his eyes. It was eerie. Okay, so let's rewrite, or I'm sorry, hold on, we're not done with this yet. Alex pulled away instinctively. Let's go back to this. Okay. So the stranger looked at him intensely, half smiling as he reached for Alex's face with his dirty hand. There was something really familiar about his eyes. It was eerie. Alex pulled away instinctively as he started to get a very odd vibe from the stranger. He couldn't place his finger on just what that was. Okay, so this paragraph started out okay. In fact, I actually used somewhat decent sentence structure here. But then I went and committed like the mortal sin of all writing, which is telling instead of showing. Now, again, I will mention, show, don't tell is not a hard and fast rule. There are times when you need, or when you really have to tell instead of show because you want to speed the pacing along. However, this is a very important moment in the story. We want to show everything that's going on in this scene. We don't need to be telling the writer or the reader every single thing. This is not one of those times. For example, what exactly was familiar about his eyes? What was the color? What was the expression? What was so eerie exactly? The reader doesn't have a freaking clue because everything is just so vaguely described. So let's rewrite this in a way that we can show a little bit more instead of telling. The stranger's yellowy eyes widened, his lips pulling into a half smile as he reached for the young man's face with his dirty hand. Alex jerked away, taking a shaky step back from the door. Or you can just say, Alex jerked away, taking a shaky step backwards. So, as you see here, We didn't really need to know all of the other stuff. All I needed to do was convey the emotions in this screen or in this scene and get the reader to start asking questions. His eyes are yellow. Well, that's strange. Since, the attention was placed on the color of his eyes in the narration, the reader now knows this is a significant feature, and they'll probably remember the eyes from the beginning of the story, which of course I didn't share, but just know that this is a significant thing. They'll already know that there's something eerie about him. What human's eyes are yellow or amber or whatever whatever I'm describing at the time. They're going to know right away that, this is being foreshadowed as him being something other than human. So let's go to the next sentence. The taller boy backed away for a moment, as if he just realized this wasn't normal behavior. "I apologize," he said, looking down at the floor. "I guess I was kind of excited to see you again." His voice had a raspy, deep tone. First of all, Amulii is this huge 6'7" tall guy, so that descriptor taller boy is completely wrong. Second of all, we're once again beating Amulii's realization into the reader's head instead of using subtlety. So how I would write this sentence is the following way. The imposing man backed away before slumping forward, averting his eyes. "I apologize," he said in a deep, raspy tone. "I'm just excited to see you again." So instead of telling the reader he seemed like he just realized something wasn't normal, we showed Alex making himself appear less threatening, having picked up on that fact already. We didn't need to tell the reader that, that he seemed or he realized something. We made that happen through his body language. So let's move on to the next sentence. Let's go back. I should probably make this a little better, but I don't really know how to do that. So anyways, oh shoot. Okay, here we go. Alex looked at the stranger and tried to remember if he had seen him somewhere before. "I don't remember seeing you," he said, eyeing the visitor as he walked further inside the house without being invited. Have we met?" "We did, once," he said, with one eyebrow raised. "I've been watching you for a while." This is where I repeated in the dialogue what was already said in the narration. So let's fix this. "I don't remember ever seeing you." Alex paused as the stranger crept closer until he was almost all the way inside the house. "Have we met?" "We did, once." His wild stare locked with Alex's. "I've been watching you for a while." So the goal was to amp up the creepy factor because Amulii was unabashedly creepy in the story. I let the dialogue do more of the heavy lifting, using the narration to add to the mood instead of telling the reader what to feel. So let's go on to scene 4. So I guess I'll start by telling you I overheard you were... I'm sorry, this is such an awkward sentence. So I guess I'll start by telling you I overheard what you were talking about in the cave, Alex said, examining Amulii's face again. The werewolf was definitely surprised. "If we are going to be friends, I want there to be no secrets between us, especially when it involves me," he continued as he plopped down on the bed. So, again, more telling instead of showing. The dialogue also slipped out of character for Alex and sounded a bit more stilted. Word choice is incredibly important when keeping a character's voice consistent. So how would I fix this? Well, "I heard what you said in the cave." Amulii froze, his mouth slightly agape as he tried to speak, but Alex held up his hand to stop him before plopping onto the mattress. "If we're going to be friends, I don't want any secrets between us, especially when it involves me." If we can put all the action between the dialogue instead of dialogue, action, it allows for a more natural flow, as I stated, above. Also, I made the dialogue less stilted and more like how a 17-year-old boy would speak. I also got rid of the werewolf was definitely surprised, because that's telling. Instead, I showed Amuli's facial expression and reaction. So let's move on to scene 5. Let's get cringy. Okay. "This is so messed up," he said, shaking his head as he poked his finger down to grab a hold of the zipper key, trying not to accidentally touch anything he wasn't supposed to. He closed his eyes and gritted his teeth as he slowly pulled up on it, being careful not to catch anything. He could feel the discomfort coming from his own pants, but he tried so hard to push those feelings away. "There," he said, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Amulii raised one eyebrow as he sniffed the air. He looked down at the boy and noticed he wasn't quick to stand back up, and the scent radiating from him was unmistakable. He didn't want to say anything about it, and instead focused his attention to the other gift he had received. He couldn't help but feel accomplished, though. Perhaps he was making Alex fall in love with him after all. Okay, so many things wrong here. First of all, I'm using an ellipse when I should be using a comma right up here, okay? Second of all, this is a great example of head hopping. Since this is kind of a common problem that new writers face when they try to write third-person omniscient, and they have no idea what they're doing, as I didn't have any idea what I was doing when I wrote this. So we're also, again, telling the reader too much information instead of showing for a more natural discovery. So here's how I would fix this. "This is so messed up." "Wait, this is so messed up," Alex whispered as he poked his finger through the hole, trying to grab the zipper without touching anything he shouldn't. After giving a slight tug, the fabric came loose, allowing the zipper to move freely until Alex was able to pull it all the way up. He swallowed the knot in his throat and turned away, his chest fluttering as the crotch of his own jeans grew uncomfortably tighter. Amulii sniffed the air and grinned. Though the scent of arousal was unmistakable, so too was the embarrassment. Instead of acknowledging it, Amulii turned and grabbed the other gift Alex had given him. So I removed a lot of the telling language and the filtering language, as well as the narrator telling the reader Amuli's feelings at the end. Amulii grinning at the beginning of this paragraph tells the reader that Amulii knows what's happening, okay? And he's getting some satisfaction knowing Alex finds him attractive. There's really no need to elaborate further in this scene. In fact, we show a bit more of Amuli's softer side by sensing Alex's embarrassment. So instead of bringing that to his attention, he doesn't want to make him feel worse by pointing it out. So instead, he just goes to the next gift and starts talking about that instead. So in the next scene, it was roughly noon, and Alex had been sleeping for a while. His body seamlessly changed back to human before Amulii woke up. The werewolf looked down at the boy, who was naked and shivering. He grabbed the blanket Alex had brought up earlier that week and gently covered the boy, careful not to wake him up. He had a rough night, and he understood how exhausted his friend was. His body chemistry had been violently altered. Even though he was in human form, Amulii knew Alex had a whole other side of himself to control now. This is very confusing point of view at first. It sort of almost seems like head hopping, but we're not really sure which point of view we're in, because once again, this is omniscient and we're not explicitly stating that Amulii is actually looking down at Alex in that first sentence. So we actually kind of think that it's in Alex's point of view. His body seamlessly changed back to human before waking up, and then we're told, oh wait, Amulii is the one looking down at him. But then, also there's a lot of rehashing and telling the reader what they already fucking know, because this was kind of rehashing the transformation scene from last night. We don't really need to get Amulii's opinion of this, because Amulii doesn't know what Alex felt. He just kind of understands what Alex is going through, but we don't need the kind of detail that he's giving here, because Amulii wouldn't really know exactly what that is. So how would I fix it? Well, by highlighting the entire paragraph and pressing delete. Oy vey. So next scene. Alex and his mother had been walking for about 10 minutes. Neither of them said a word as they traveled along the lake shore to the forest path. "Are you sure you don't want to come home?" Sally said, looking up at her son. He appeared to be lost in thought as he continued to walk without saying anything. Alex kept his eyes fixated on the path. Alex kept his eyes fixated on the path. He thought about how he would answer her. This is just typical new writer over-explaining, over-writing. There's just so much being said that doesn't really say much of anything. So this is how I would fix these sentences. Alex and his mother didn't say a word as they walked along the lake shore toward the forest. As they approached the path through the trees, Sally finally broke the silence. "Are you sure you don't want to come home?" Alex kept his eyes straight ahead, his thoughts racing through all the possible ways he could tell her no without it turning ugly. I used less words to convey more emotion in these sentences than just flat out telling the reader everything. Once again, I cut the filtering language. Remember, filter words are those that pertain to the senses, that put a filter between the reader and the character. So instead of saying that Alex appeared to be, we can just show him lost in thought. Instead of saying a character looks at something or hears something, we can just show the thing that, that they're seeing, or tell the reader about the thing that's making the noise. We already know that the characters are looking and listening. We don't have to add that extra filter to put more distance between the reader and the characters. So scene 8. "Why are you so difficult?" he shouted as he hit his fist against the water. He was so childish when he threw tantrums like this. "It's a simple promise, Amulii. It's also the most important promise I'll ever ask for. If I can't trust you, I can't love you. Yeah, I'll be your mate, but I'll hate you," he replied lividly. There's just so much awkwardness going on here, and I'm going to probably piss a lot of people off, or at least some people off, because people are going to think that this is an opinion instead of just being straight up bad writing. The first glaring issue is the bad habit left over from years of writing fan fiction, interrobang. Interrobang is the use of multiple punctuation marks to indicate strong emotion. So it could be multiple exclamation marks. It could be an exclamation mark paired with a question mark, as is with this case. Or it could be 2 question marks in a row. These are unacceptable in any fiction written professionally, unless, of course, you're conveying a text or a chat message, or you're writing something like how a character would write it. If you're using interrobang anywhere else, it means you're not letting strong emotion come through in your dialogue or your narration. You're instead relying on a crutch to do that for you, and it just comes across as being lazy and novice. In fact, in the first sentence, I wouldn't even use an exclamation mark, considering the dialogue tag that follows. I'm already indicating strong emotion by Amulii's actions. So how would I fix it? Well, I would write it this way. He roared and slapped his fist against the water. "Why are you so difficult?" It's a simple promise, Amulii, and it's also the most important promise. If I can't trust you, I can't love you. Yeah, I'll be your mate, but I'll hate you. Still not a fan of the dialogue, but whatever. We'll leave it like that. Since Amulii roars and slaps his fist against the water, we can already guess he's throwing an immature temper tantrum. And he's also shouting. We learn that because he's roaring right now. So we let his actions do the telling. We don't need to say that he shouted. And we also don't need to put in that he said lividly. Alex, we'll let the tone of the dialogue do the telling. We don't need to add that extra dialogue tag at the end. It just kind of looks tacky. So now for the bonus scene. We're going to walk through this travesty step by step. This is kind of the end of the book, and this was just sort of a letdown. All right. They talked for a few hours, but the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. Amulii could feel the energy of the gateway, and he knew his mother had activated it. I have such a hard time with passive voice and filtering language in this draft. And as I was reading, there were just so many. I could point out basically anywhere in the story, and I would just get slapped in the face with passive voice and filtering language everywhere. It was just constant. Not only did the third person omniscient pull the reader away from the characters, this filtering language just put even more distance between me and the characters. And this is why, if you remember what I was saying at the start of this story, how when I was reading through it again, I didn't know why I wasn't having a good time writing or reading it anymore. I wasn't having such a good of enough time reading it as I did writing it. And it was because when I'm going back and reading it, there's too much distance between me and the characters for me to get a sense of anything really going on. So we can get rid of "they talked for a few hours." Since this is already implied from the sentences that preceded it, I'm not going to add those sentences just because it's boring exposition. So how I would fix this is, I would say, the sun lowered behind the powdery mountain range, and a prickle of static energy buzzed through the air, causing Amulii's fur to rise. At last, his mother had activated the gateway. It adds a little bit. It might not be the prettiest sentence. I mean, I'm looking at this going, ugh, but it kind of shows a little more. We get more sensation of what's happening here instead of just telling us that Amulii could feel the energy. We actually have the reader experience the prickle of static that buzzed through the air, causing Amulii's fur to rise. So it's allowing the reader to experience that, to feel that, instead of filtering it to them and telling them. In the next sentence, "Alex, it's time for us to go before it's too late," Amulii said sadly. He kind of wanted to stay, but he wanted to leave too. He was a mixture of emotions. So these sentences are obviously repetitive. The reader can already infer that Amulii was a mixture of emotions because it was literally just spelled out in the sentence before. Also, there's no need for the ellipse here. We can just get rid of the adverb sadly. While I'm not totally against adverbs, if you can use a stronger verb or phrase, modifiers are usually not necessary. So how would I fix this? "Alex, it's time to go before it's too late." Amulii faced the mountains and breathed in the fresh scent of Lake Malene one last time. Jasper had been his home for so long that he was almost sad to leave it behind, but his mother and friends were waiting for him on the other side. Next sentence. Alex gave his mother one last hug goodbye. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," she cried hysterically as she squeezed the young lupine tighter. By the way, I hadn't created the word Mawchalet yet, so lupine was the actual descriptor here, or the name of the oh so original name of these werewolves. When I say she cried hysterically, that just ruins the entire mood here. As mentioned earlier, word choice is very important, not just for dialogue, but also for the mood of the scene. If you're wanting to set a positive mood for example, if you want to set a positive mood for a scene, you would focus on the sun shining rather than the shadows it casts. Well, the same holds true here. This is a very sad moment, but it's made almost comical by Alex's mother's reaction. It's like that person that blows their nose really loud during wedding vows. It just totally ruins the moment. That's sort of what this sentence just did. Plus, "she cried hysterically" is being used incorrectly as the dialogue tag. This is something that you see a lot of in fan fiction, but it doesn't fly in novels. So how would I fix this? Alex wrapped his longer arms around his mother, pulling her close. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," Sally whispered, hugging her son so tightly that she never wanted to let go. But once he relaxed his hold, she did as well. So, I'm not really happy with this sentence choice, but I'm also in a rush because I just want to finish this quickly. instead of, she crying hysterically, I wanted her to whisper, "I love you," into our son's ear while hugging her son so tightly, because she doesn't want him to go. She just doesn't want to let go. But once he relaxed, she did as well. She had to let him go. So this kind of just conveys that just letting her son grow up, letting her son leave the nest, even though she doesn't want him to. In fact, throughout the whole story, even in the actual published version of the Mark of Amulii, Alex's mother is very overbearing. She's very controlling. She wants to be in control of every aspect of her son's life. So the fact that she's having to let go of her son is a very powerful and impactful moment. And you don't want that ruined by just this goofy word choice of her crying hysterically. So the next sentence, or the very final sentence, he turned around and picked up the bags they had brought and followed Amulii across the land bridge connecting the island to the mainland. He felt a rush of memories flood his mind as he could picture their first encounter right here on the rocks. He never thought that night would change his life forever, but now here he was over a year later, about to walk into a world he had only seen briefly once before. Amulii held out his large furry hands and raised them up in a circular motion. His eyes were glowing brightly as the once invisible gateway suddenly appeared. So once again, very, very wordy, lots of filtering language. This is how I would basically change these two paragraphs. He turned and picked up his bags before following Amulii across the icy land bridge. A rush of memories flooded his mind as he pictured their first encounter on the island, not knowing then that it would change his life. Now he was about to walk into a new world he had only experienced once in a vision. Amulii raised both hands, moving them in a circular motion. His irises burned amber as the once invisible gateway cracked like lightning before tearing open. So this, again, just adds a little more sensory overload, or more senses to the reader. It adds, more of the showing of, his irises burning, the gateway cracking, Alex kind of reminiscing, back when they first met. Now he was going to be going into a new world he had only experienced once in a vision. I had neglected to put that into the sentence, so it's almost like he went to this new world and experienced it, but no, it was a vision of this world that he experienced. That's very confusing wording. It's always a trip to go back and read things that, that I've written over the years. The published version of the Mark of Amulii isn't as well written as the Varcross Key, and the next book I published will be written better than that. So if you ever get frustrated and think that you'll never be a good writer because your writing sucks, well, my writing sucked too, as was apparent with all of this, but I got better. And as long as you have the drive to push yourself, to learn the basics and practice, you'll get better too. So that's really all I have to say for today. If you liked this video or found it helpful, please like and subscribe. Also, check out my books at theliteratebeast.com. Put the links below. And if you want to support me further, sign up to my Patreon. As always, I'll see you next time.